Congressman Tom Lantos of California and Republican Congressman John Porter of Illinois. The caucus met Wednesday to hear testimony of alleged human rights violations by Iraqi soldiers in occupied Kuwait. A number of witnesses testified at the hearing, including the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, Kuwaiti citizens who escaped from their occupied country, and a representative of Amnesty International. Since Iraq's August 2nd invasion of Kuwait, stories of beatings, executions, rape, and illegal imprisonment have been carried over Kuwait's closed borders to the outside world.
I'd like to welcome all of you this morning. This is the Congressional Human Rights Caucus hearing on the human rights atrocities in Kuwait. We will begin with opening statements from myself and my co-chairman, Tom Lantos, and from the members who are here. And then we will proceed with 3 panels of witnesses who will testify regarding the situation in Kuwait. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait has dominated the headlines of our nation's newspapers for almost 2 months now. Operation Desert Shield, economic sanctions, and other aspects of the world's reaction to Saddam Hussein's horrendous breach of international boundaries have been examined from almost every possible perspective. But very little has been reported about what is actually happening inside Kuwait. We are aware that refugees from all over the world have been filtering out and that thousands of Americans among them have fled. But there are still thousands of Americans who remain hostage, the majority of which are men not permitted to leave by Iraqi officials. Many of these men have been strategically moved to Kuwait's munitions and chemical-producing sites to be used as a shield against possible U.S. air attacks. In light of Saddam Hussein's repressive regime in Iraq, it is obvious that Kuwaitis and foreign nationals who remain in Kuwait are in grave danger. Since Saddam Hussein came to power in 1979, any voice of dissent has been violently suppressed in Iraq. The Kurds, Iraq's largest minority, have been brutally and continually repressed for seeking recognition of their distinct ethnicity. Over the past 5 years, hundreds of children whose parents were reportedly political activists have been arrested and tortured. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds have been relocated in efforts to diminish a collective Kurdish presence. And hundreds of villages were destroyed, killing thousands by a chemical offensive aimed by Iraq against their own Kurdish civilians. With these sorts of egregious violations having been perpetrated against the innocent people in Saddam Hussein's own country, it is obvious that those opposing Iraq's illegal occupation in Kuwait today are in grave danger. Rape, destruction, and terror rule in Kuwait today. Reports are slowly beginning to filter out of Kuwait. Stories depicting mass extrajudicial killings, widespread arrests, and torture under interrogation continue to emerge from the thousands of people who have fled Kuwait. After reviewing Iraq's dismal human rights record and recent reports outlining conditions in Kuwait, it is our duty to ensure the safety of both foreign nationals held in Kuwait and the citizens of Kuwait and neighboring countries. I would like to thank those testifying today for their courage in sharing with us the horrors they saw firsthand in Kuwait. By bringing your testimony to the attention of Congress, you are helping your friends and relatives who remain in Kuwait. I'd like to call now upon my co-chairman, one of Congress's outstanding leaders in fighting for human rights around the world, Congressman Tom Lantos of California. Tom?
Thank you very much, Chairman Porter. And let me say at the outset that this is an extraordinary hearing of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. We have held literally hundreds of hearings and meetings and briefings dealing with human rights violations around the globe. But we have never dealt with consummate evil run amok as clearly as we are dealing with it this morning. The bipartisan Congressional Human Rights Caucus has dealt with violations of human rights in a tremendous array of countries, running from the Soviet Union years ago, where our efforts may have played a small role in the dramatic improvement of the situation, to human rights violations in Tibet, South Africa, Chile, Cuba, dozens of places. In most of these places, we dealt with regimes which denied that they were engaged in human rights violations. One of the remarkable aspects of Saddam Hussein's reign of terror is that he prides himself in his human rights violations. He telescopes and advertises and proudly proclaims human rights violations he intends to engage in the future. The State Department report on human rights around the globe for the year just ended calls human rights in Iraq as being in an abysmal state. That State Department report was issued prior to the naked aggression of Saddam Hussein against the sovereign, peaceful, non-threatening, small nation of Kuwait. What we have seen since the 2nd of August boggles the mind. Vast numbers of men, women, and children, yes, children, were killed, executed by the Iraqi regime. Premature infants in incubators were sentenced to die by having the incubators removed and the children allowed to perish. Vast numbers of civilians have been subjected to the most creative and imaginative measures of torture that man's evil mind is capable of concocting. The world's television screens have seen the plight of hundreds of thousands of refugees, most of them very poor people, who after years of hard work in Kuwait were compelled to leave, leaving their meager resources behind, trying to survive in refugee camps until they can be evacuated to their countries of origin, from Egypt to Bangladesh. The totality of human suffering that Saddam Hussein has brought to hundreds of thousands of human beings, most of them third world people, destitute, poor, desperate, will take years for the civilized world to comprehend. We should not be surprised at what Saddam Hussein has done, because his record clearly indicated the direction in which he was moving. The use of poison gas against his own Kurdish citizens some years ago, which was a subject of a Congressional Human Rights Caucus hearing. The nightmarish pictures on the cover of Newsweek of piles of bodies of Kurdish women and children killed by Saddam Hussein's poison gas attack on the Iraqi village of Halabja, populated by Kurdish citizens, is one of the most horrendous pictures to be presented to this world since the pictures of the Holocaust 45 years ago. He is now determined, with his capability of chemical, biological, and soon nuclear weaponry, to bring untold horror to this region. It is our purpose to highlight during the course of this morning, with the assistance of qualified witnesses, Saddam Hussein's human rights record in Kuwait, and to awaken a world which is still in many ways attempting to save his face, to provide him an attractive way out, rather than recognizing that what the world is confronting in Saddam Hussein and his regime is consummate evil run amok. I look forward to listening to our witnesses, and I want to thank my friend and colleague for chairing this hearing.
We're joined by three members of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, and I want to call on each of them for a brief opening statement as well. Buzz Lukens of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I'd like, first of all, to compliment the Co-Chairman, Congressman John Porter, and, of course, Congressman Tom Lantos, for their aggressive handling of the focusing and the spotlighting of human rights around the world, but especially today, the inhuman cruelties subjected upon the Kuwaiti people by a moral midget, a maniacal dictator in a country that is armed beyond comprehension. Very briefly, it seems as if Saddam Hussein is willing to sacrifice lives and human rights simply to expand a little evil empire of his own in the Mideast. And I look forward to testimony by, first of all, our respected Ambassador Sheikh Al-Sabah, and of course those people who lived through this. And we're all really grateful for the hosting and the sponsoring of this hearing today, for these individuals to tell us firsthand what really happened.
Congressman Don Payne of New Jersey.
Thank you. Let me commend both of the chairpersons of the Human Rights Caucus for calling this very important hearing this morning. We can no longer in the 21st century continue to have acts that happened years and years ago. Things that have happened this year are similar to things that have happened 600, 700, 800, 900 years ago, when Vikings went around Europe raiding and pillaging, when the Crusades for many years traveled back and forth, invading and having destruction in their path. And I think that the world has grown to a state of technology. It's a global village interdependence. What happens in one country affects another. We can no longer live in a world where we have aggression, stronger pushing the weaker, people being powerless. And so I believe that this hearing, hopefully we can come up with some rationale and ideas as how we can move in the future to prevent these kinds of acts from happening. And I once again commend the chairperson for calling this very important meeting.
Thank you, Don. Finally, Congressman Ron Makeley of Rhode Island. Ron.
Thank you. I, too, would like to commend the co-chairs for this very timely and I think very historically important hearing. This hearing will set the stage for how we announce to the world what is going on in Kuwait and the devastation which I believe is occurring to this country. In recent weeks, some people have questioned why we as the American people got involved in Kuwait. Some have suggested it was merely for our own economic interest to protect our strategic oil supplies. But the world has stood behind us for a much more important reason than just economic. and that is that we cannot permit one country to so savagely take over another country and completely begin a systematic process of obliterating a people who have lived on this face of the earth for as long as the Kuwaiti people have lived there. If the news reports are correct, we are hearing that some 60% of the Kuwaitis are being systematically moved out of their country. Streets are being redesignated. In fact, the capital city has been renamed. What we do here today may set the stage, as I indicated earlier, for the next 10 years. We cannot permit human rights to be violated. We cannot permit one country to so violently and so systematically destroy another country. We must stand firm against this outrage. We cannot, as a civilized leader in this world, permit such an atrocity to occur. For those Kuwaitis who remain in Kuwait, we must make sure that they have individual rights. We cannot permit a country to so obscure their fundamental rights, which have been the cornerstone not only of our Constitution here in this country, but of humankind throughout history. As a nation of people, we have a duty to look beyond our own borders to make sure that individual human rights, which is what this caucus is about, are protected around the world. And so, Mr. Chairman, I commend you for holding this hearing so that we can tell the world that this country will not permit Saddam Hussein to take over another country and decimate the human rights of its people. Thank you.
I want to thank each of the members of the caucus for joining our panel this morning. We will proceed with our first witness, the Ambassador of Kuwait, His Excellency Sheikh Saud Al-Sabah. Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, distinguished congressmen, may I first of all, on behalf of my government and on behalf of my people in Kuwait, express to you, to the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, and to the, most of all, to the President of the United States and to the people of the United States for the support we've had since the invasion of my country by Iraq. The support of the United States that we've had, in my view, has cultivated and brought together the whole world public opinion in support of our cause. Your noble initiative to hold this hearing today is indicative of the interest and concern of the people of the United States regarding the basic violations of human rights by the Iraqi occupying power in Kuwait. Mr. Chairman, we share many values and we share many views emanating from the U.S. Bill of Rights when we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the important elements that my people and the U.S. people share. Everyone in the world now is witnessing the brutality of the Iraqi occupying power over my people. Since their unprovoked invasion of my country on the 2nd of August, they have resorted to the inhumane behavior against the people of Kuwait and against other nationalities, especially the U.S. and Western people inside my country. They have resorted to acts of mass executions. They have resorted to mass acts of rape, and they have resorted to mass acts of looting and pillaging of my country. We have not, in the history of mankind, witnessed such acts of atrocities by so-called people as resembled by the Iraqi military occupation of my country. As you have so eloquently put it, Congressman Lantos, and described the basic violations of human rights with regard to the hospitals in Kuwait, the schools in Kuwait, and the looting of private homes that's taking place, and the mass destruction of the infrastructure which we so proudly built in the country over the last 30 years. Adding on this, what they had resorted to a complete destruction of the institutions inside Kuwait, the university, the schools. People have moved in for this sole purpose of destroying human beings and destroying infrastructures. We have repeatedly called for the humanitarian organizations to be allowed in, like the Red Crescent, the Red Cross. We have also called for international correspondents and international media to be allowed to go and witness their atrocities in my country. And repeatedly they have refused and turned down such requests. And that tantamounts as evidence of their intent to harbor all their acts of atrocities inside the country. Quite recently, we have seen the report that came out from Amnesty International, which is a factual report on their atrocities inside Kuwait. Today you're going to hear not hearsay evidence. You're going to hear eyewitnesses who have lived through these atrocities by the Iraqi people. And I do hope that through you and through our friends in the United States, we can all find somehow any measures for rescuing my people and rescuing mankind inside the country. As you again have eloquently put it, Congressman Lantos, the Iraqi regime has resorted to acts of atrocities and mass executions of their own people. And it's only, again, normal for them to do against other foreigners, like us, unlike the U.S. hostages they have there. I do not want to prolong my opening remarks, as they have been already covered by you, distinguished gentlemen, in your opening remarks. And I will give the chance and the opportunity for you to address any questions that you have regarding the human rights violations of the Iraqi occupying power of my country. But again, I must emphasize the importance of time. I must emphasize the importance of time. Time is running out. With the livelihood of my people who have been deprived of their even basic foodstuffs. The Iraqi army in the last week now have resorted to the act of looting the foodstuff from homes, denying medical supplies and medical care for my people. Hospitals are only there to treat Iraqi soldiers and Iraqi nationals. The people you see fleeing from Kuwait are people who are in need of medical care. They are forced to flee their homeland. And you can all understand how painful it is to leave your homeland. They've been forced to do so by the Iraqi authorities with a policy of displacement and depopulating the country. They are moving in Iraqi families to take over the Kuwaiti homes. As you already said, you have also resorted to renaming streets, renaming hospitals, renaming the whole country. Such aggression, such occupation, such violations should and could not stand in our time of civilized nations. And I do hope that through you and through our friends in the United States, we can find a quick and prompt solution in order to rescue my people and to rescue others in Kuwait. I thank you, Sir Chairman.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your testimony. Before we proceed to questions, we also want to welcome to our panel Congresswoman Connie Morella of Maryland and ask her if she would like to make any statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Am I on all right like this? Oh, great, good. Thank you. I want to commend you and Mr. Lantos, two very distinguished co-chairs of this Human Rights Caucus, for calling this hearing. I this morning just talked to a friend of mine who is Kuwaitian, who just returned here to the United States, and we discussed the tenor of this particular hearing. And Your Excellency, what I have to say in an opening statement picks up on some of the things that you have already mentioned, but I think they can bear repeating because there's such atrocities that are taking place. I'm hoping that meetings such as this are really going to help to focus greater attention on this issue and help us to gain a more complete understanding of what's happening in that part of the world and our responsibility to each other, and help us to shape our effort to resolve the problem. The Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein has denied its citizens their basic human rights in order to maintain its dictatorial rule. They've consistently been denied freedom of expression and association, subject to arbitrary arrest and imprisonment, deportation, torture, disappearance, and summary and political execution. Iraq's disdain and contempt for human rights was blatantly expressed by its use of chemical weapons against the Kurdish minority. The Iraqi government is currently forcibly relocating its Kurdish citizens under a program of such magnitude that it threatens their ethnic identity and cultural survival. In the report, Country Reports on Human Rights Practices for 1989, the Department of State reported that, quote, Iraq's human rights record remained abysmal in 1989. Iraq was cited for stifling political opposition, torture, summary execution, disappearances, and arbitrary detention, also lack of fair trials. In addition, Iraq has been linked to and supports various terrorist groups and is on the State Department's list of terrorist nations. Given this history, there should be little surprise about the reports, as sickening and dispiriting as they are, which we're receiving and will be receiving today about this conduct of Iraqi troops and governing officials in occupied Kuwait. These reports demonstrate and attest to not only the literal rape of individuals trapped in Kuwait by the Iraqi invasion, but also the collective rape of a country and its people. An entire country is being looted of almost anything that can be carried off, including not only such obvious items as expensive cars and national art treasures, but even traffic lights from city intersections. While Saddam Hussein spent his country's wealth on military hardware in the 1980s and sacrificed more than 1 million Iraqi lives in war with Iraq, Kuwait invested in technological expertise to serve and improve the well-being of its people. But little matter, for with the help of his troops, Saddam is simply taking for Iraq all that he has neglected to provide for his people in the past. Perhaps there has been no more sickening report demonstrating this practice that those which describe Iraqi troops entering Kuwaiti hospitals and disconnecting newborn babies from life-sustaining incubators. Some reports indicate that babies have been left on the floor to die as incubators and other neonatal care equipment is packed up for transport back to Iraq. Amnesty International, who will be testifying, has taken detailed testimony from hundreds of people fleeing Kuwait since the Iraqi invasion August 2nd. According to Amnesty, their testimony builds up a horrifying picture of widespread arrests, torture under interrogation, summary executions, and mass extrajudicial killings. And these atrocities are not being committed only against those offering armed resistance to the occupying forces, but also against men, women, and children found with opposition literature and the Kuwaiti flag or photographs of the Emir of Kuwait. Reports indicate the possession of such items is punishable by death. I would like to indicate that this is a real extreme example of man's inhumanity to man, and I'm reminded of the words of John Donne, who said, "No man," and I know he meant woman, "no man or woman is an island. We're all connected to each other." And in that, I hope that there will be some benefit from this hearing, and appreciate not only Your Excellency being here, but all of the people who are here to share with us some of the experiences. And I thank the chairman of the committee for allowing me this opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've been joined by two other members. First, a member of the Executive Committee of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, Congressman Jack Buechner of Missouri. Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Excellency, thank you for being here. I know that we join with you and in concert with your people, both still in Kuwait and in exile, and hoping that justice will prevail and that they will be restored to legitimate rule and also to the rights of a free people. I would thank you for also giving us the opportunity to ask you questions and to find out more about what is truly happening. We are basically sitting here trying to read news reports and listen to the various electronic media and try to sift through that. Hopefully you'll be able to provide us with some information, some of which I'm sure has not yet been heard. But I know that you will come away from this meeting knowing that we stand in solidarity behind the people, whether they were Kuwaiti citizens or they were the various personnel who were working in Kuwait. And I would hope that we can get to some of the plights that have been inflicted upon those individuals, because that type of abuse has created refugee situations in the world that are further wreaking havoc on the resources of some countries that I know you would hope would be very sympathetic to your plight, such as Jordan. And therefore, there are many things that we need to know, but most of all, I think you need to know and convey to your family and to your citizens, fellow citizens of Kuwait, that we deplore human rights violations anywhere in the world, but especially those that are at the behest of an armed aggressor.
Thank you, Jack. Congressman Bob McEwen of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I, too, appreciate your giving us this opportunity to look further behind the headlines as to the human rights violations that are taking place in Kuwait. Your Excellency, we've met before, and let me say, under very, very adverse circumstances, you are doing an excellent job of attempting to communicate to the world those who superficially wish to make this a battle over oil, as I saw on the evening news last night when they took people off of the street and said this obviously superficial misunderstanding of what's at risk here. Opportunities such as this are more helpful to understand this is a question of human rights. This is a question of what do people believe in and what do people stand for. If a nation can use its military might to rape and pillage and destroy, and civilization and civilized nations do nothing, then we are in for a bleak period in world history. I don't believe, however, that is the case, and I believe that the unification of nations to stand in support of the legitimate government of Kuwait tells us that while this may be difficult, it is obviously right. It has to be done. And I was very disturbed again this morning to hear a statement on Paul Harvey News, who in each day has seemed to have a decreasing grasp of what is at risk for the world. If we sit back and allow those who believe in tyranny to spread their terror over neighbors. History has shown that you cannot feed a tyrannical dictator. No matter how many nations you feed him, he is not satisfied. And history has shown that if we would have stopped at one in times past, perhaps if we would have drawn the line immediately rather than waiting for 4 or 5 nations, many lives could have been saved and the world could have been spared a great deal of terror. I think in this case is exactly the same analogy, that this has to be stopped. The line has been drawn. Kuwait must be free. It must be independent. And anything less than that would do civilization and the world a disservice. And so therefore we stand united with you and wish you well in the effort that you are undertaking to communicate to the world that this is a question of human rights, of civilization versus anarchy, and it has to be made here now.
Thank you very much, Congressman McEwen. Questions for the ambassador?
I have a couple of questions.
Tom Lantos.
Mr. Ambassador, I would like to ask you, because you are the focal point of information coming out of Kuwait, whether the information that we have through Amnesty International and other sources corresponds to the information you have, specifically on the following items. It is my understanding that there has been a very large number of executions in Kuwait by the invading Iraqi military forces. Do you have any estimate of the number of individuals who were killed since August 2nd, either Kuwaiti citizens or others who were living in Kuwait by the Iraqi authorities?
Congressman Lantos, I think I mentioned in my opening remarks that because of the Iraqi refusal to let people in Kuwait, humanitarian organizations or foreign correspondents, to witness such atrocities, information coming out to us is very sporadic. We do have some line of communications with Kuwait where we get first-hand information on daily basis what's going on. To answer the question, yes, there has been mass execution of Kuwaitis who were not just involved in the resistance, but who were even suspected of being involved in the resistance. Last week there was a mass execution of 21 university professors who refused to open up the university and who refused to take down the picture of the Emir and replace it by the picture of Saddam Hussein. And for that reason they were executed summarily by the Iraqis. There are other executions taking place. It's difficult for us to document, but I know many friends of mine have been executed. I know many relatives of mine have been executed. And I know many other nationalities have been executed for not cooperating with the Iraqi invasion. There have been Egyptians, there have been Asians, and others. And it's very difficult for us, unless there is a supervisor or supervision inside Kuwait, to know exactly what is going on. But from the report we're getting, the answer to your question, yes, there is a mass execution taking place, but in some places in open areas, in some places undercover.
Mr. Ambassador, we fully realize that your information is fragmentary. Are we talking about dozens of people? Are we talking about hundreds of individuals who have been executed, to the best of your knowledge?
Congressman Lantos, I'm here testifying, and I want to be as correct and as truthful as I could be. You could be talking about hundreds, you could be right. But the numbers we have been missing in Kuwait that have been reported to us by their families who were able to fled Kuwait or are still inside Kuwait, they're reporting they're missing. We know many of them have already been executed, many have been detained and taken to Iraq for further interrogation and imprisonment and harassment.
Let me ask you a question about the tortures that we are getting information about, and see if this corresponds with your information. We have been advised that there has been rape on an indiscriminate and massive scale. There has been the most brutal torture of both men, women, and children, with prolonged beatings on the most sensitive parts of the human body, the extraction of fingernails and toenails, electric shock. Are these the kinds of reports you are getting?
Yes, sir, they are the kind of reports that I am getting, all the above. All the ones you have mentioned, we are getting the reports, and we've had also now some victims of these tortures that are now in Saudi Arabia and are now in Egypt also, who have had women that have had their nails pulled out and they've been subjected to electric shocks and etc. The torture you described, sir, is what is being done by the Iraqis all during the invasion and still continue to do it throughout.
Final question I have, in some ways, for the long run, has the most sinister implications. It is my understanding that there is a forcible mass displacement of the Kuwaiti population by Iraqis loyal to Saddam Hussein in anticipation of Saddam Hussein at some point calling for a plebiscite, which then would take place with Kuwait's own people no longer able to vote in an election, presenting the world with the phony result that individuals living in Kuwait want to see the absorption of Kuwait by Iraq. This is an attempt to obliterate an independent and sovereign nation. Is this basically what, on the basis of your information, is happening, Mr. Ambassador?
Congressman Lantos, what Iraq would resort to any means, I think, are unpredictable by anyone. This I've heard as a possibility by this policy of displacement, that Saddam Hussein will one day turn around and have a plebiscite inside Kuwait and say this is the wish of the Kuwaitis. We all know, as you have quite rightly put it, that this policy of displacement might lead to such phony procedures, or they might resort to such phony procedures. But we must be quite aware of it, that such things, such ploys by the Iraqis, they have resorted to since their invasion of this ploy or this phony government they installed, and then this government came by and wanted a unity with Iraq, thereby annexing Kuwait and etc., as we've heard in the past. Such ploys and phony measures are within the anticipation of the Iraqi regime, and we must be quite and ready to face it, because as you quite rightly said, this will not stand.
So perhaps the occasional opening up of the Kuwaiti-Saudi border to allow Kuwaiti citizens to leave is really not a humanitarian gesture, but it is a sinister plan designed to diminish the indigenous Kuwaiti population within Kuwait. Is that correct, Mr.
You're quite right, Congressman, in saying so. This is the attempt on the part of the Iraqis. And when they opened the borders in the south with Saudi Arabia and allowed people to get out, they also stripped them of all their identities, with all their valuables, and they took everything with them, and they had only the clothes on their backs, which they left in the country. We are concerned about all the forged documents and identities that the Iraqis have from the Kuwaitis in fulfilling this kind of policy of displacement, which I referred to in my opening remarks. And I agree with you entirely that this could be another Iraqi ploy they're trying to play in allowing Kuwaitis. Is far, far from a humanitarian kind of measure. They are, again, doing this in order to stake out certain Kuwaitis who they wanted to arrest, officials who are in the security or in the army. And when families attempt to leave the border in the south, they allow women and children, and they interrogate the men between the ages of 15 to, say, 40, to see whether they are wanted by the Iraqi regime, whether they have been involved in resistance movement, whether they are in the Kuwaiti security or in the army. If they are proved to be so, they are detained and they disappear. We don't know. We have hundreds of Kuwaitis we cannot account for. They've been taken to Iraq. All young people between the age of 15 to 40, in that range. So your conclusion is quite right in your founding.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions for the Ambassador? Mr. Lukens?
Mr. Chairman, I have one question, Mr. Ambassador, if I might. Along the lines of the economic rape of your country, how long do you think it will be, given the fact that we're almost 70 days into the occupation, before the Iraqis have basically taken everything of economic value and of technological value, of educational value from your country. We know that the reports are substantiated now that they have removed such things as the traffic lights, all hospital equipment. They've totally removed all equipment from universities and schools. Could you elaborate on that a bit and just give us some kind of time estimate of your timetable for the total removal of everything of economic value physically from your country?
Congressman Lukens, what they have done already in removing materials from Kuwait, they've already accomplished from all public institutions. The Central Bank of Kuwait has been emptied. All the banks in Kuwait have been emptied. All the public buildings, the government offices, departments have been emptied. Schools, university, hospitals, anything which is not nailed down have been taken away. And even if it is nailed down, it's removed. Our concern here, everything is replaceable. This could be replaced in time. Our concern here is for human lives and violation of human rights. This is really our concern here. Everything in material, I mean, the spite and the greed of the Iraqis, this could be replaced in due time by us with the help of our friends. We are concerned here with the well-being of the Kuwaiti people and others who are inside Kuwait. And this is why I've re-emphasized the importance of time here, is that if they are deprived of their foodstuff, they are deprived of medical care. How long could those people survive under terror, under oppression by the Iraqis? Psychological warfare in the media inside Kuwait, the TV inside Kuwait. They have also jammed foreign radios like Voice of America or the BBC, or tried to jam it in order that people inside Kuwait cannot get the correct or right reports from abroad. There is no communication with the outside world. So in essence, they are isolated inside. And the Iraqis are doing what they're doing to the people in complete isolation from world public opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions for the Ambassador? Ron Makeley, a member of the Executive Committee.
Thank you. Your Excellency, based on reports that you have received, are you able to make any conclusion whether or not our economic embargo will have the desired effect prior to the decimation of your country of having Saddam Hussein withdraw into Iraq? And if so, would that be necessarily a desired solution? And if you feel that the economic embargo will not work, is it better that we use military force sooner than later?
Congressman, my views on the sanctions and the economic embargo on Iraq as implemented by the Security Council to force Iraq, with a view of forcing Iraq out of Kuwait, allow me respectively to disagree on this fact. I don't believe personally that Iraq in the short run or the long run will be adversely affected by these sanctions. Knowing Iraq is a big country. Iraq is an agricultural country. They can sustain themselves indefinitely with foodstuff. They can sustain themselves with all other needs of the Iraqi people. The Iraqi regime now is providing food for their military and for their party, and the Iraqi people come third, and then my people inside Kuwait have nothing. After they have robbed all the foodstuffs from Kuwait and they've shipped it back to Iraq, or trucked it back to Iraq, there are plenty of supplies, plus what they grow inside Iraq. The borders with Jordan is still open. There are hundreds of trucks coming in from Jordan to Iraq. Even with the air embargo that has been imposed now on Iraq by the recent Security Council resolution, is being violated indirectly, because flights come into Amman, Jordan, they unload into trucks, and they go into Iraq. So in concluding, I would reach the following conclusion. Sanctions and embargo on Iraq will not, and I repeat, will not bring Iraq down on its knees to force it out of Kuwait. The other factor involved here, you might ask, is that there is an embargo on oil shipments from Iraq. Therefore, Iraq cannot sell oil. Therefore, they cannot get hard currency. And I will have my answer on this too, because Iraq has some allies that are providing Iraq with funds with which to withstand the sanctions and the embargo. Therefore, to finalize this whole thing, I would reach the conclusion that neither in the short run or the long run, Iraq will be forced out of Kuwait because of the sanctions. And I think what was said by the Iraqi foreign minister 2 days ago reaffirms this fact. And he said that they will not be affected by it, and they will continue to defy it.
Further questions? Congressman Buechner?
Yes, thank you, John. Ambassador, to expand on that a little bit, you said that Iraq has allies that are providing it with hard currency. Is that through loans, or are they acquiring the oil? And who are we talking about? Are you talking about Iran?
This is a public hearing, Congressman. I don't wish to get into sensitive information on this. But we have witnessed and we have seen certain movements of funds through central banks in other countries who are providing credit lines for Iraq in hard currencies to enable them to further buy spare parts and other needs for the Iraqi army. And by the way, the reports that you've been hearing that Iraq imports 80% of foodstuff, I can't really find any justification with just reports. You know, Iraq is self-sustained in their foodstuff. What they import are luxuries coming in from other different countries. And if you wish, after this hearing, I could provide you with the information where the funds are moving from different central banks that are providing credit lines for Iraq.
Yes, Excellency. I think that the members of the committee would very much like to have that confidential briefing with you, and I thank you very much. I yield back.
Congresswoman Morella.
Thank you. Just briefly, Your Excellency, what kind of communication do you have with the people in Kuwait? How does that operate? How do you get your reports and the daily communication, if it is?
I don't wish to discuss this in a public hearing.
No,
I think that's
okay.
other sensitive information.
The other part was to pick up on the question my colleague had asked, too, in terms of the possibility of military force. Do you want to comment on that, or is that too sensitive?
I intentionally avoided commenting on it. I think Congressman McTelley knows what my answers were leading to, and you could reach your own conclusions.
I mean, we are interested at some point, maybe not even now, for your opinion about the role of the United States and the United Nations in this. I'm sure you've shared it with our State Department, but it might be of some interest to us to hear, too, from you.
Yes, in my opening statement, I did mention this fact, the role of the United States vis-à-vis the role of the United Nations. And I said that, for your benefit, what I said is that the U.S. position has cultivated the United Nations and cultivated the whole world public opinion behind Kuwait. And I would have the chance to discuss other matters that you have touched upon, maybe at another opportunity.
Thank you.
Congressman Don Payne.
Your Excellency, what is your feeling, and you don't have to answer this if you feel it shouldn't be, of the role that King Hussein of Jordan had played, and how important do you feel that cooperation from Jordan is if, one, we are going to attempt to have the embargo, although you feel that the embargo is not necessarily the way to go? How important is it to have the full cooperation, if that's possible, from King Hussein?
Congressman Payne, I think the major loophole we have here with the implementation of the full effectiveness of the sanctions, the loophole here we have is Jordan, which the borders are open, although they declared that they respect and implement the sanctions. We don't see any proof of that. We don't see any indication of that. The borders with Iraq are open, and the foodstuff and other luxury items and maybe spare parts are being trucked in from Jordan to Iraq. So I would not agree with what they have said regarding their implementation of sanctions. And this is the major loophole we have now, that the borders with Jordan are still open and Iraq is getting what they need through these borders. So they claim that they have honored the sanctions is completely unfounded in our views.
Thank you.
Bob McEwen.
Mr. Ambassador, obviously Saddam Hussein has intelligence sources that tell what the United Nations are up to in surrounding his country. What is your analysis of what his next move will be should the preparations for the defense of your country be completed within the next 3 to 4 weeks by the United Nations?
I don't personally think that Saddam Hussein will do anything. Saddam Hussein's policy now would be to sit tight where he is in a defensive posture, to strengthen his grip over Kuwait in an attempt to outlast the patience of the multinational forces that are in Saudi Arabia now, especially the United States. He hopes to break this alliance, whether with the multinational forces or the United Nations. He believes that his time is on his side. He could sit there and outlast, in his belief, outlast your patient and others, thereby accomplishing his mission. I don't think Saddam Hussein will resort to any provocation, because he's heard it so many times from the US that no military action will be conducted until there is provocation. Now, he could read between the lines. Now, if he reaches that conclusion, there will be no provocation on his side. He will sit tight. He will not resort to any other means, like the rhetoric we've heard regarding sending missiles into Israel and etc., etc. These are rhetorics. And he will just sit tight and outlast you. That's what he intends to do.
If the United States were to threaten to make a move at any time, what would his reaction be at that point? Can you speculate on that?
What would his reaction be? I think I'm not concerned with what his reaction will be. We can understand what his reactions will be. I'm quite sure that the reaction of the Iraqi people themselves will be so welcoming for any military action against their regime to get the Iraqi people freed from this tyranny of a regime over them. By doing so, my friend, you're not just relieving the whole area from this dictator. You're relieving also the Iraqi civilians, the Iraqi people who have been under his dictatorship for so many years.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us this morning, and thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Would our second panelists please come up and be seated at the table? That is Miriam Elahi and Dr. Hassan Al-Ibrahim. I'm going to ask each of them to present their testimony before we ask questions of both of them. And let me begin by introducing Mrs. Miriam Elahi. She is the Government Program Officer for North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe for Amnesty International. And Amnesty has just concluded a fact-finding mission to Bahrain, where they interviewed victims and eyewitnesses of human rights abuses in Kuwait. And we welcome you this morning, Miriam.
Thank you, Chairman Lantos, Chairman Porter, distinguished congressmen and women, for
Could
the
you pull
opportunity.
the microphone close to you and speak right into it?
For this opportunity to testify before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. I would like to briefly describe some of the human rights abuses being committed by the Iraqi army in Kuwait. A more detailed testimony which includes Amnesty's long-term concerns on the widespread and systematic violations of human rights by the Iraqi regime inside of Iraq, is contained in my written testimony, which is being submitted for the record. Hundreds of people are believed to have been arrested in Kuwait by Iraqi forces since August 2nd. Refugees fleeing Kuwait have told Amnesty International that Iraqi forces have arrested men, women, and even children for possessing opposition literature, the Kuwaiti flag, or photographs of the Emir of Kuwait. People are said to have been arrested and in some instances killed for their non-violent opposition to the Iraqi invasion, including the failure to demonstrate the proper allegiance to the Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Amnesty International has received numerous reports of the routine torture of detainees by the Iraqi security forces. Victims have suffered rape, electric shocks, prolonged beatings to sensitive parts of their bodies, the breaking of their arms and legs, and the pulling out of their finger and toenails. Others have been summarily executed. Iraqi forces have reportedly killed scores of unarmed civilians. Boys as young as 15 have been shot in the head and their bodies dumped outside their houses in the streets. In one incident in Kuwait City, Iraqi soldiers reportedly fired at a group of 35 women and children who were peacefully protesting Iraq's annexation of Kuwait. An eyewitness told Amnesty that 2 boys, aged 13 and 16, and a 20-year-old girl were killed by bullets in the head and heart. Amnesty International calls upon the Iraqi government to immediately end all extrajudicial executions, summary killings, acts of torture, and arbitrary arrests. Thank you.
Ms. Elahi, thank you very much. Next, Dr. Hassan Al-Ibrahim, President of the Citizens for a Free Kuwait. He will provide a statement and then introduce a brief video featuring footage that was recently filmed in Kuwait. Dr. Al-Ibrahim, thank you very much for being with us.
And members of the committee, allow me to introduce myself.
Please speak right into the microphone if you can. Put it right in front of you.
I am Hassan Al-Ibrahim. I am the former rector of Kuwait University and more recently the former Minister of Education in Kuwait. I am a founding member of the Arab Organization for Human Rights, and for 3 years I have been member of this organization's Board of Trustees. I am presently the chairman of Kuwait Society for the Advancement of Arab Children and president of the new organization in the United States, Citizen for Free Kuwait, established after the Iraqi invasion of August 2nd. In conjunction with the Society for the Advancement of Arab Children, and is the only society in the Arab world, sir, 10 days ago, I had an interview with the Voice of America, which was in Arabic, and I have talked about the atrocity committed by Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. 2 days ago, a friend of mine who was able to get out of Kuwait told me that as a result of my interview, the society was ransacked, fax machines were stolen, telephone were stolen, computer were stolen, and the only thing untouched, fortunately, sir, the library, because we have a section that documents human rights violation of Saddam in Iraq. The library, fortunately, was not touched. Before August 2nd, 1990, the human rights record of the state of Kuwait has been one of the best in the world, as attested by all respected independent human rights organizations and the U.S. Department of State. All this changed with Saddam Hussein invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd. And this conjunction, sir, please allow me to read 4 articles of Kuwait Constitution, Part 3, under the heading of Public Rights and Duties. Article 29 stated, all people are equal in human dignity and public rights and duties before the law. without distinction as to race, origin, language, or religion. Article 30, sir. Personal liberty is guaranteed. Article 31st. No person shall be arrested, detained, searched, or compelled to reside in a specified place, nor shall the resident of any person or his liberty to choose his place of residence or his liberty of movement be restricted, except in accordance with provision of law. No person shall be subjected to torture or to degrading treatment. Article 34. An accused person is presumed innocent until proved guilty in a legal trial, at which the necessary guarantee for exercise of the right of defense are secured. The infliction of physical or moral injuries on an accused person is prohibited. Sir, these articles have been observed in Kuwait since the introduction of the Constitution and before that. I appear before you, ladies and gentlemen, and it saddens my heart to present the following example of Iraqi human rights violation in Kuwait. These have been confirmed by the CFK and by Amnesty International. Execution and murder, rape, use of electrical shocks, prolonged beating to sensitive parts of the body, breaking limbs, pulling hair with pincers, pulling out fingers and toenails, psychological threat of sexual assault or execution. Those who oppose the Iraqi occupation either been executed, tortured, or thrown into prison. Humanity should not stand idle while Saddam Hussein, the butcher of Baghdad, systematically continue on his bloody path. For erasing Kuwait identity from the map, rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, this shall never, never, never happen. Kuwait and its people shall prevail as we shall restore human rights and dignity to our country once again. Sir, by the end of my statement, allowed me to introduce or show to you this videotape that we have received. The horror of the Iraqi atrocity is best seen through the eyes of those who witness and experience it firsthand. This videotape will show the eyewitnesses who have seen in their own eyes what happened in Kuwait.
The Iraqis killed 5 little kids without even conducting any investigation. They killed them because they had some literature that says, "Long live the Emir." The Iraqis broke into a respectful man's gathering room. This man happened to be a preacher who also gave religious lessons to the Kuwaiti children. The Iraqis accused him of being a member of the resistance force, so they imprisoned him. 10 days later, this man came to us and his body was burned. Then the Iraqis took him to his house and shot 4 bullets into his head, right in front of his mother. The man died and his body was full of burns and the evidence of torture.
They were carrying the banners of Kuwait, and children were also accompanying them. Children at the age of 3 and 4 were carrying the banners. 5 children shot randomly, including 3 with their heads completely torn apart and their brains could be seen. Of course, they died immediately, and 2 were shot in their chest and abdomen. We exerted our utmost, but the savage shooting of the Iraqi soldiers of Saddam Hussein did not allow us the chance.
وكان أمامنا سيارة هوندا
There was a green Honda ahead of us. There were 2 Kuwaiti young men in it. The Iraqi soldiers stopped them. We were right behind them. Inside their car, the soldiers found identification cards indicating that the 2 Kuwaiti young men were members of the National Guard, or perhaps affiliated with the Kuwaiti forces. There were approximately 12 or 13 cars detained, waiting to be searched. The Iraqi soldiers pulled the 2 Kuwaiti young men out of their car. They pulled them right out before our eyes. There were children in the other cars. The Iraqi soldiers had the 2 Kuwaiti young men stand in the middle of the road and shot them before everybody's eyes.
كانوا بيسيبوا المرضى الكويتيين يصفوا في دمهم ويموتوا في الشوارع.
The bodies would be left in the streets until they rot. They prevented any car from carrying the bodies to the hospital to be placed in refrigerators or to be buried. They stole the patient's food and went into the nurses' residence under the pretext that they were providing security, when in fact they raped the nurses.
At this residence, after a few hours of the storming, because they had run away with any clothes they had on, to the hospital, there were attempts of rape for the nurses, the Egyptian nurses and other nationalities from Iraqi soldiers. And I'm a witness to this particular incident. And the Iraqi soldiers attacked the hospital, the maternity hospital, and took 5 nurses to rape them. Luckily, gunfires were heard outside the residence, so the soldiers ran away in case it may be resistance.
When I was leaving Kuwait, I had my sick little baby with me. The Iraqis refused to let me take my sick child. They said he was less than a year old, and I had to leave him here. When I begged the soldier to let me take my sick baby, they tried to pull him out of my arms. They ridiculed me to the point that I cried. When I cried even more, they laughed at me.
When they brought my mentally retarded sister to us, they told us that if you cannot feed her, we can take her back to Baghdad with the rest of the mentally retarded and put a bullet in each of them.
The treatment of the chronic cases stopped. Cancer cases were brought out of the hospital, and unfortunately most of them died. The deformed children, of course, were evacuated also and died. In short, medical care in Kuwait is deteriorating continuously. She was driving her car with her clothes in a convoy of cars in an area between Baghdad and Al-Fallujah. The brave Iraqi soldiers, the heroes of the Arabic nation and the protectors of the eastern gate of the Arab nation, they went out to her with their knives, attacked her, took the cars and dropped her, left her in the street all alone until another car with an Egyptian family picked her up and brought her back.
My name is Badr Ali. I am Kuwaiti. I got shot on the first day of the invasion as I was going to work. As I was passing by the conference palace, I saw a soldier, and he shot me in my head. And one of the bullets broke and shattered a window near me. and the other bullet went through the rear window. Did they shoot you for no reason? Yes, they shot me for no reason.
The
Iraqis abducted a man at the Salmiya police station because he had an audio cassette of the Emir's speech and the speech of Sheikh Ahmed Al-Qattan, a religious preacher. They took his 15-year-old daughter upstairs and raped her brutally and then returned her to her father. Once, they attacked the supermarket, took all the men and women out, killed the men in front of the women. The method of shooting the men was to prolong their suffering.
As soon as the Iraqis came in, they entered the hospitals. And the first thing they did, they went to the intensive care units for the extremely sick and removed the tubes and the equipment for the heart patients. And of course, the patient died immediately.
Some people went to their workplace, soldiers for example, they just disappeared, never came home again. One of our friends went to ask about his son. He saw a group of his son's friends there. The next day, when he went back, they'd all disappeared. Another thing happened. They went into the house of some friends of ours and they asked, where is so-and-so? When they discovered that the person wasn't there, they took the nearest relative to him. This happened at the beginning of the occupation, and until this day, they haven't heard anything from them.
I can tell you an example. They took two of my relatives, two boys. One 17 and one 16 years old were having a pamphlet in their car and continued to torture them for 3 days with no food and no water.
التشبيه الوحيد اللي الواحد ممكن يقوله على الموقف دوت
It was as if a gang has entered a country and had a limited time, say 1 hour, to steal as much as they can. They took everything they found. The country turned into a wasteland.
I want to thank our two witnesses. I want to ask you to stay at the witness table and be joined by the next panel, and then we'll, after they testify, we'll have questions perhaps for all of you. Is that permissible? Thank you. Will the panelists from panel 3 please come and join them at the table? I believe there are enough seats.
Ruth, then Abdullah.
Yeah, Ruth.
Then Dr. And Dr. Hadi, and then one more.
Oh, you got one more? I'm sorry, there's 5 then.
Yeah. Then Hankin.
We're not going to do, yeah.
To a Kuwaiti Air Force major. We met at Memphis State in 1978, and when he completed his studies, he asked me to join him in Kuwait to start our life together. I was able to be among the first group of hostages to leave Kuwait on September 7th with my 3 children. At that time, in 1978, when I went to Kuwait, the society was less westernized than it is today. However, my cultural transition was eased by the warmth and support of my husband's family and the expatriate community with which I worked. I was employed by Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research, where women had the opportunity to work at all levels. It has been one of the most prominent research institutes in the Middle East, specializing in water resources, mariculture and fisheries, environmental science, and petroleum. Now I'd like to tell you about the Kuwait that I knew and loved. a Kuwait that was filled with the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Cars driving everywhere, people in the streets and the markets visiting each other. The atmosphere in Kuwait was very easygoing. The Kuwaitis, who are a very gentle and warm people, made one feel at ease immediately. We never locked our doors to our homes or to our cars. We always felt safe. Your privacy was always respected. Since the Iraqi invasion, Kuwait is a mere shadow of the once vibrant country. Everyone fears the panic and desperation in everyone's faces is something I'll never forget. I was so afraid to leave my home. I would only leave if it was absolutely necessary to go out and get food, or to travel from one house to another when we heard that the Iraqis were in our area and we were literally fleeing for our lives house to house. We locked our doors. Sometimes we slept on the floors. We were afraid to speak on the telephones, as if you spoke after 2 minutes, they would trace the call and come to your house if they heard a Western voice on the phone. I lived in a state of constant terror and anxiety, not knowing if the Iraqis were going to break down my door in the middle of the night to rape me, torture my children, or take my loved ones from me. I was so petrified that I used to sleep with my curtains open a little bit so I could wait until the morning light would come so I'd realize that I had made it through another night. The Iraqis have systematically destroyed the Kuwait that I came to know and love. The modern high-rise hotels and government buildings have been reduced to ashes and soot. Schools and government buildings and hospitals have been stripped bare. All of the desks, the blackboards, the books, the hospital beds, the medical equipment, the medicine, the life-supporting equipment have all been stolen by the Iraqis. Even before I left Kuwait, a little more than a month after the invasion, this peaceful country has been turned into an Iraqi military installation. There's an Iraqi tank about every 300 yards on the waterfront road, which is called the Gulf Road. Every neighborhood is occupied by at least 50 to 100, if not more, Iraqi soldiers, whose behavior is very unpredictable depending on their mood. We lived under constant threat of physical brutality. For example, a friend of our family's who worked at Kuwait Airways was out after the curfew, which at that time was 7 o'clock. The soldiers picked him up and broke his back in 3 places. They beat him so hard, unnecessarily. The terror we lived was unbelievable. The sister of a friend of mine, who is Kuwaiti, was heading toward the border when they opened the borders in Saudi Arabia with her mother and her brother and her 1.5-month-old baby she was holding in her arms. When she arrived at the border, the Iraqi soldier asked her, "Is that a male or a female child?" She said, "This is my son." He said, "Give him to me. We've been ordered to kill all male children." She said, "Kill us all. Kill everybody in the car, but you're not taking my baby." She told the soldier, "You're not a father, you don't have a mother, you don't know what it feels to lose a child." And the Iraqi soldier actually let them go. The story gives me the chills every time I think of that moment of terror for that poor woman. At the border, men from 15 to 35 years old were forced out of their cars and taken away, some never to be seen again. In a society where men are instrumental to the social and cultural fabric, this act alone can completely debilitate Kuwaiti women. However, in spite of their gentle nature, the Kuwaiti women are quite strong. They will overcome these loathsome experiences inflicted upon them by the Iraqis, but at a great personal and psychological cost. Iraqis have attempted to control the Kuwaitis by threatening to kill their families, as well as their neighbors if they don't do as they like. For example, 5 Iraqi soldiers were found dead in an area in Kuwait in a certain neighborhood, and as a result, they went in and looted and robbed the houses and burned the homes. The cousin of a Kuwaiti friend was a military officer in Kuwait, and he was in hiding. He went home just to change his clothes and was there 5 minutes. They picked him up. They tortured him, they abused him, and after 10 days of torture, they brought him to his parents' home, called out all of the family members, the neighbors, and shot him dead in front of his mother. And then they burned the mother's house. Iraqi soldiers are taking young Kuwaiti girls, aged 13, 14, and 15, and raping them. The physical horror of this speaks for itself. However, in this society where virginity is a prerequisite for marriage, it is even more devastating for these poor girls. A girl who is not a virgin brings shame on herself and on her family. A friend of my husband's heard of a man who had both of his ears cut off until he revealed the name of 15 people who were in the resistance movement, and then those 15 men were found dead and slaughtered. It is a normal Iraqi practice to arbitrarily arrest 50 to 75 Kuwaitis each afternoon and throw them into the jails in each neighborhood, where they are tortured and humiliated and urinated on and forced to consume their own feces. They are interrogated, and if the soldiers do not like what they say, they shoot them. Rather than allowing the Kuwaitis to bury their dead, the Iraqis dumped the bodies on an ice skating rink near Kuwait City. This was the first place that you would look if your relatives would come up missing, your brother or your father. You would go to the ice skating rink and look through the bodies to find your relative. The Iraqi soldier respect for human life seems so negligible that they make bets on how many breaths a Kuwaiti will take between the time he is shot and the time he dies. I want to be happy to be back here in the United States, but I feel empty and devastated. I think of the suffering of the Kuwaiti people and all other nationalities I left behind in Kuwait. After what I've witnessed, I don't know if I'll ever be truly happy or settled again. My children are so worried about their father. They ask me if there's a school that they can go to that will teach them how to pray to get their prayers answered. I always say no, that God will hear their prayers wherever they are, and just to keep praying for Daddy's well-being. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you very much. Several of our witnesses are concerned that their families may receive retribution if their identity is revealed, and we want to ask our friends in the media to respect their wishes in this regard. Our next witness is using an assumed name. We will call him Abdullah and ask him next to testify.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I was in Kuwait when the invasion took over. And as a loyal Kuwaiti citizen, I made contact with the military to express my willingness to contribute or to volunteer in the army. But they asked me to stay where I was, because at that time the barracks were surrounded by the Iraqis, and they could be shot by the Iraqis or mistakenly by the Kuwaitis. I stayed in Kuwait 7 weeks, almost 7 weeks, under the invasion, and consisting of doing my part to contribute the recovery of my country. I cannot discuss all of these things for fear of reprisal against my family members who are still in Kuwait, or compromising the ongoing efforts of the resistance. However, I will share a few accounts of the atrocities witnessed in Kuwait after the August 2nd invasion. While at the market trying to buy food for my family, I saw 2 Kuwaiti young boys, 15 or 16 years old, in handcuffs, escorted by Iraqi soldiers. And the soldiers knocked on the door, escorted to a house, and the soldiers knocked on the door, and a child answered. They asked her to call her mother or father. And when the women came out, they asked her to identify, or if she knew these 2 boys. She said, yes, they are my sons. Then the soldiers asked her to come out and to call all family members to come out of the house. And when they gathered outside the house, they instructed the 2 young boys to stand off the wall, and in full view of the mother, sister, and young brother, and as well as around 50 men and women in the marketplace, they shot and killed the two boys. No Kuwaiti has accepted the invasion of our country. All have found ways to resist the systematic destruction of our country. Young boys has joined the resistance. Women and girls have distributed flyers and leaflets. Kuwaiti have housed and protected Westerners in their house at great risk. Kuwaiti have refused to renounce their pride in country, their identity, and their religious beliefs. 3 days before I escaped, I participated in a funeral of my friend. He was a religious man. He was tortured and killed, his fingernail extracted, his beard has ripped off of his chin. Because of what? Because he delivered a speech in a Friday religious ceremony condemning the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. The Iraqi soldiers, after 2 days, searched and found him. Like I said, they tortured him and killed him. And his body was deposited near the mosque where he delivered the speech. Kuwaiti men injured in defending their freedom, the restoration of our sovereign territory and legitimate government cannot safely go to the hospital for treatment. They must seek shelter and medical attention in homes of those they trust. They are subject for primitive care, medical care, from volunteers, doctor volunteers, who risk their lives just to care for them. They often die of wounds which otherwise can successfully treated. I am here today, Mr. Chairman, to tell you that the fight is still going on in Kuwait under great personal risk. While I number myself among those fortunate to manage to escape from Kuwait without injury and to be able to continue my resistance outside Kuwait, my heart, like those of my family and my friends, remains within Kuwait. I salute American people to their position, to their support, and I hope they continue supporting us in fight against tyranny and terror. And I witnessed a catastrophe things which was happened in my country. Like I said, I cannot reveal, or I cannot say all of it, just to protect my family members and my friends who are still in Kuwait. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sir, we thank you for your willingness and your courage and the willingness and courage of all of our witnesses in testifying this morning. Next, Deborah Hadi, American-born, married to a Kuwaiti.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Deborah Hadi, and I appreciate very much...
The microphone right there, yes.
Okay. I appreciate very much to be here today to share with you some of my thoughts and feelings regarding the terrible events that have taken place in Kuwait. I met my Kuwaiti husband here in the United States when we were both attending the University of Louisville. I've spent the last 12 years in Kuwait. We had a wonderful life. We've seen a lot of the world. But now I'm afraid for my husband's life and the life we once had together. I'm afraid I'll never be able to go home or I'll never see my husband again. Mr. Chairman, while America is my country, Kuwait is my home. Life in Kuwait before the invasion was basically worry-free. We were treated with respect, dignity, and compassion by the Emir and the Kuwait government and people. Although you were expected to be responsible for yourself, no one was expected to do without in Kuwait. Kuwait is still providing for us here while we are here until we can go back. It's been difficult for me to express my feelings since the Iraqi invasion on August the 2nd. Terror, confusion, despair, vulnerability, emptiness, and anger are just a few of the emotions I've felt since our world was literally turned upside down. Even during the Iran-Iraq war, when Iran terrorized the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait and held many of us hostage in the American school where I worked, were we treated so badly. Nothing like what is going on now in Kuwait. The primitive, uncivilized behavior of Saddam Hussein's forces was never expected in a million years. A few months ago, we could never imagine the horrors that we've had to experience in the last 60 days. The acts witnessed by many of us who fled our homes go beyond what many would consider even flagrant human rights abuses. It's clockwork orange in Kuwait now, and chaos and mayhem have intruded into every corner of our lives. Some of the horrors are vivid, and they'll remain with me forever. I lived across the street from a school which had been occupied in Kuwait. It was occupied in the first weeks during the invasion. Several days after they took over the school, we heard screaming, and we went up to the second floor of the house, and you can look right down into the school. There was a woman and a small girl and a man who was on the ground, had his hands cuffed behind his back. It was her husband. They raped the woman and the child. Then they shot the man in the head. The next day, these tortures went on daily. The next day, we seen boys brought in. They were also handcuffed and put on their knees. And they said that, well, the Iraqis said that they were in the resistance. And they held their eyes open and put lit cigarettes into their eyes. And after they finished that, they shot him. And we also seen them take one of the resistance, and they took his pants down and took broken Coke bottles and put up their backsides to get information from them, and when they couldn't, they shot him. The Iraqi soldiers would come across the street and knock on the doors to get water or cigarettes or food or whatever. And at these times, I would have to hide in closets because they said that they would kill families, wipe out whole families if you were caught hiding a Westerner or American in their homes. And it was terrifying. It was the most horrible experience I've ever experienced in my life. Our cousin went into labor. She was pregnant. And I went with my husband to take her to Sabah Maternity Hospital, where upon our arrival, there was a Kuwaiti woman there. She was in hysterics. She was screaming, In our car, we was coming up slowly because we needed to get our cousin into the hospital. And this woman, the soldiers, they took a bayonet and stuck it through her stomach and impaled her on a wall. Whereupon that time we took our cousin home and delivered the baby ourselves. I can only ask how these animals can commit such barbaric and inhuman acts and then deny that these acts ever took place. How can they purport to be part of a civilian international community when they commit uncivilized acts of unspeakable brutality? When President Bush likened Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler, it rang true to me. Although Saddam Hussein may not yet have carried out an organized genocide against the people of Kuwait, he certainly is committing acts against humanity of unimaginable brutality. He is seeking to wipe the country off of the map and its people. In Saddam Hussein's campaign to Iraqi-ize Kuwait, he has taken the most basic items necessary to life and death from Kuwait. Patients prematurely discharged from hospitals die from exposure. Inexplicable civilian deaths apparently are caused by soldier reprisals. Resistance casualties have left hundreds dead. We have no way to prepare the citizens for burials because the mortuaries have been pillaged and looted. Even the freezers. To rob someone of their life it apparently has not been enough. Stripping every shred of dignity and respect seems to be the goal. This is both ghastly and ghoulish as well as inhumane. I suppose we're all here to tell our stories of dreadful and unthinkable acts, as distasteful as that job may be. Frankly, I wish I could say that I didn't see anything or that these things didn't happen, but they did, and I'll be forced to remember these nightmares of real life for the rest of my own life. In comparison to some, I guess my first-hand experience may even be considered mild, or the norm since August 2nd. But I cannot escape the images of death, destruction, brutality, and helplessness that these horrible scenes have imprinted upon my mind. It's important to step up and describe what we've seen in Kuwait so that others may know, and international action and U.S. action can seek to prevent further innocent bloodshed. I appreciate this opportunity to pay tribute to those Kuwaitis and compatriots who have died and suffered fighting this oppression. There have been profiles in courage living with the viper in their midst. And I must say that if something isn't done soon, the Kuwaitis just cannot, they won't last much longer if they don't get help soon.
Deborah, thank you. Dr. Khalid Al-Nasser.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the caucus, thank you for holding this hearing today. My name is Khalid Al-Nassar. I am a Kuwaiti national. I'm currently staying in Seattle, Washington. Both my undergraduate and postgraduate work has been done here. I spent several years studying in the United States. After I have finished in 1979, I went to Kuwait and I worked as the assistant professor of medical genetics. And later, in addition to my profession, I was the Vice Dean for Administration and Finance for the Kuwait University School of Medicine. 12 years after the Iraqi invasion, I escaped Kuwait with my family in a car caravan crossing the desert to Saudi Arabia. The story of that morning, August the 14th, is one of emotional torture, ill treatment and humiliation. To flee from the Iraqi invaders, I took my wife and my 9-year-old daughter in the family car, and we met at a predetermined location very early that morning at around 4:30, 4:45. We met approximately 70 to 80 displaced Kuwaiti families. Our goal was to cross the desert, a mere feat in itself. And then enter to Saudi Arabia and reach freedom. Somewhere in the middle of the desert, we were intercepted by Iraqi soldiers. The guide, with about 10 other families ahead of us, were able to escape the interception. The Iraqi soldiers, however, got a hold of us. They forced us out of our cars by force. They searched us in a miserable way, and they searched our belongings, and they have verbally abused us. They detained, interrogated us for some time, and I feared first for my child and my wife, as the Iraqis became hysterical when they thought a coat hanger in my suitcase was a gun. In addition, I heard all the rumors of the atrocities that were inflicted upon Kuwaiti women and children in that caravan. After the soldiers were satisfied with their search, however, they gave us the wrong directions towards Saudi Arabia, and they let us go. It was probably their hope that we would lose our way and die in the desert. When the cars behind our group saw what happened to us, some of them threatened and intimidated, they turned around and went back to Kuwait. I followed the Iraqi soldiers' directions for about 600 yards or so. Now this is a desert, there is nothing in it, no roads. After that 600 yards, and I could see the tank and the soldiers, I had to veer to the right and go to where I thought the guide was heading. And sure enough, we reached Saudi Arabia. Now, gentlemen, I know of many extreme injustices committed against the citizens of Kuwait. Many of them family members and friends. I saw the Iraqis shoot at kids. I saw them kill a woman in a demonstration. She had a picture of the Emir, and they killed her. I saw their indiscriminate firing from their tanks at Kuwaiti homes. My sister's home was destroyed by a tank. I saw them loot, and I saw them burn supermarkets. The Iraqis forced so many people out of their homes and moved into them. I know 3 people whose families were ousted by force from their homes. I saw handcuffed Kuwaitis forced to lie face down on a highway of black asphalt at noon, where the temperatures must have exceeded 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Iraqi soldiers continued to keep the Kuwaitis face down on the pavement by placing their feet on their heads. I and my wife were witness to that, and my child. One close friend of mine, a physician at Mubarak Hospital, told me that 3 days after the invasion, the Iraqis converted his hospital into military barracks. They installed snipers on the roofs, and soldiers infiltrated the premises. I saw the snipers on the roof of Mubarak Hospital. The Iraqis took all the patients, most of them sick and old, and forced them at gunpoint into the hospital corridors, not in their beds, into the ground in the corridors. Their rooms were evacuated to make room for wounded Iraqi soldiers. Patients were viciously and deliberately injured while they were being moved. And as I know, blood transfusions were prohibited, except for Iraqi soldiers. Half the patients in that hospital died because they were moved from their rooms and removed from their life support systems and machinery, or because they were denied medical treatment. The wounded civilians, and I know one who was wounded in his right leg, were prohibited from receiving blood transfusions. Now, the ill treatment of the sick, gentlemen, is a severe violation of all that is decent and just. Many hospitals have been destroyed. The Ahmadi hospital was ransacked. Medical supplies, beds, equipment, everything was taken from that hospital. The Shuwaykh hospital, a primary care unit, and that's where I live, in that residential section, was completely demolished. All medicines have been confiscated for the sole use by the Iraqi soldiers. I am relieved to see my family safe in the United States, but I would welcome a return to my home country. As a fellow Kuwaiti, I stand before you stunned by reports just being released on the Iraqi treatment of my countrymen. Reports of civilians, men, women, and children, killed outside the context of armed conflict are almost unbelievable, except that I have seen the inhumanity of this invasion firsthand. Boys as young as 15 are shot for punishment, as punishment for alleged opposition to Iraqi invasion. And methods of human torture, ranging from rape to electric shock treatment, to prolonged beatings, the breaking of limbs, and the extraction of finger and toenails are commonplace. The invaders are criminals. I pray that they may someday, soon, stand trial for all these crimes. I urge you, gentlemen, to condemn the extreme intimidation and the violent abuses of the Iraqis against my people. I urge you to stand fast against this terror. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Nassar. Next, Beth Hankin. Beth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to speak before you today. My name is Beth Hankin, and I'm an American from Monticello, Iowa, and I'm married to a Kuwaiti. My husband remains a captive in Kuwait. Prior to leaving Kuwait, September 8th, on the first U.S. flight available, I was a school teacher at a Secretary American school, a research assistant for a professor at the University of Kuwait. I also worked for several private Kuwait companies during my 5 years of residency in Kuwait City. From August 12th to September 8th, when I left Kuwait, I lived in a nightmare. Iraqi soldiers repeatedly and arbitrarily fired outside my front door, terrorizing myself and everyone in the neighborhood. The cousin of a close friend was brutally tortured for distributing leaflets for the Kuwaiti resistance. After being arrested by the Iraqis, they broke his knuckles, ripped off his fingernails, burned him on several parts of his body, and as the Amnesty International report has attested, he's just one of the many who suffered a horrible, unspeakable abuses. After the invasion, I lived within a stifling atmosphere of fear and intimidation. The Iraqis claimed it was illegal to wear a beard in Kuwait, since a beard signifies membership of a religious sect. Bearded men were given Hobson's choice, the so-called option of shaving, in essence degrading their religious beliefs or death. People going to the mosque to pray are met with intimidation and violence. The Iraqis have entered the mosque and arrested the bearded religious men. One such man's dead body was eventually found in pieces. Children of Kuwaiti Western parents were not allowed to leave Kuwait, even with a parent. Houses were searched frequently. Iraqis found a gun. The family was given 20 minutes to evacuate before Iraqis destroyed their home and possessions. Similarly, if the Iraqis found one dead Iraqi soldier in the vicinity, they would bomb homes arbitrarily. All this is clearly reminiscent of actions taken by Hitler in the 1930s and 40s. It was chilling to be caught in this horrifying web. An American companion of mine, still living in Kuwait, has a Kuwaiti friend who was forced to leave her home permanently as punishment for resistance, fighting in her neighborhood. In the same neighborhood, Iraqis went into the homes and kidnapped children from their parents. These children have disappeared. Their parents fear that they are lost forever, or much worse. Beyond intimidation, the Iraqis have inflicted violent atrocities against Kuwaiti citizens. In one incident, I heard that a woman looking for her son was told to go to an area called Salmiya. When she arrived, she saw several Kuwaiti dead men hanging. Rather than dying from strangulation, they died from the bleeding of castration. To protest against the one-month anniversary of the occupation, Kuwaitis went to the roofs to shout for a national call to prayer. The Iraqis responded by shooting them with guns, tanks, flares, killing men, women, and children. Mr. Chairman, this is a personal tragedy of enormous proportion for thousands of Kuwaitis and for all those Americans and others supporting Kuwait and upholding principle. I miss my husband desperately and pray for his safety. Ironically, at this moment, it is a blessing we did not have children, since under Iraqi law, they would have been forced to remain in occupied Kuwait. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final witness is also using an assumed name, and again we ask our friends in the media to respect the need for her to protect her family. And we finally call on Nayirah to testify.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Nayirah, and I just came out of Kuwait. My mother and I were in Kuwait on August 2nd for a peaceful summer holiday. My older sister had a baby on July 29th, and we wanted to spend some time in Kuwait with her. I only pray that none of my 10th grade classmates had a summer vacation like I did. I may have wished sometime that I could be an adult, that I could grow up quickly. What I saw happen to the children of Kuwait and to my country has changed my life forever. It has changed the life of all Kuwaitis, young and old. We are children no more. My sister, with my 5-day-old nephew, traveled across the desert to safety. There was no milk available for the baby in Kuwait. They barely escaped when their car was stuck in the desert sand, and help came from Saudi Arabia. I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country. The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well. After I left the hospital, some of my friends and I distributed flyers condemning the Iraqi invasion until we were warned we might be killed if the Iraqis saw us. The Iraqis have destroyed everything in Kuwait. They stripped the supermarkets of food, the pharmacies of medicine, the factories of medical supplies, ransacked our houses, and tortured neighbors and friends. I saw and talked to a friend of mine after his torture and released by the Iraqis. He is 22, but he looked as though he could have been an old man. The Iraqis dunked his head into a swimming pool until he almost drowned. They pulled out his fingernails and applied electric shock to sensitive private parts of his body. He was lucky to survive. If an Iraqi soldier is found dead in a neighborhood, they burned to the ground all the houses in the general vicinity and would not let firefighters come until only ash and rubble was left. The Iraqis were making fun of President Bush and verbally and physically abusing my family and me on our way out of Kuwait. We only did so because life in Kuwait became unbearable. They have forced us to hide, burn, or destroy everything identifying our country and our government. I want to emphasize that Kuwait is our mother and the Emir our father. We repeated this on the roofs of our houses in Kuwait until the Iraqis began shooting at us. And we shall repeat it again. I am glad I am 15, old enough to remember Kuwait before Saddam Hussein destroyed it, and young enough to rebuild it. Thank you.
Nayirah, thank you. Let me thank all of our witnesses. We've past 8 years in the existence of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. We've had scores of hearings about human rights abuses throughout the world. And I know my co-chairman, Tom Lantos, will join me in telling you that we have never heard, in all this time, in all circumstances, a record of inhumanity and brutality and sadism as the ones that the witnesses have given us today. I don't know how the people of the civilized countries of this world can fail to do everything within their power to remove this scourge from the face of our earth. And the witnesses, by providing to us eyewitness accounts and reports detailing the conduct of the Iraqi soldiers under the command of Saddam Hussein, have done a great service to their country and to ours and to all countries of the world who must join together and take whatever action may be necessary to free the people of Kuwait from this aggression and brutality. Tom Lantos.
Well, let me first express my deepest thanks to all of you. You have performed a service of incalculable value. And one can only hope and pray that every American, and indeed every citizen of every civilized country, will hear your story. There are rare moments in history when we are confronted with human depravity of incredible proportions. We had the killing fields in Cambodia. We had the Holocaust with millions innocent killed. And now we have the rape of the people of Kuwait. I do want to ask some questions, if you'll allow me, of 3 members of the panel, Ruth, Deborah, and Beth, because they represent to me very fine examples of young American women who were brought up in a free and open and democratic society where human rights are respected. And they were thrust into the nightmare of a terrorist gang engaging in actions that we associate with the dark moments of human history. So let me begin with you, Ruth, if I may. Where were you born? In Memphis, Tennessee. Will you take a mic? You went to elementary and high school in Memphis. You have brothers and sisters?
I have 3 older sisters.
3 older sisters. Since you have come home, have you told them this story?
Yes, sir.
What is their reaction?
Just, it's so unbelieving for them to realize that I lived through it. They understand what Saddam Hussein and his army are capable of, but it was quite unbelieving for them to realize that their baby sister lived through all of that and was able to get out and tell the story.
Have you spoken to church groups or other groups in the community?
Yes, sir. I've been real active in Memphis with the World Affairs Council and speaking to gifted children at several schools, and I'm happy to do that.
Now, Ruth, do people truly believe your story, not in the sense that they would doubt your veracity, but can they comprehend the enormity of the cruelty that you were exposed to?
I think it's hard for Americans. We live so nice in our country, in America, to comprehend the terrors and the nightmares people suffered. I can't answer that. I know it's hard to realize that people can do this to other people, but the people in Iraq are capable of anything and everything in the worst ways, and they've shown that to me, how they've treated the people in Kuwait and other foreigners there.
Beth, let me ask you this. Have you spoken to various groups in your community? Where are you living now?
I live in Monticello, Iowa with my parents, and I have many people. When I first came back, I told people that I'd be willing to come and speak to them about my experiences and about what's happening in Kuwait. I've talked to various organizations around eastern Iowa and also to socially conscious churches and to many schools.
May I come to you, Deborah? You have shaken up all of us, even those who have seen horror firsthand, like myself. What has been your reception in your community where you live now when you spoke of your experiences?
People have been reduced to tears. They can't comprehend it. I mean, still, I've watched these things with my own eyes, and still, sometimes I'm just not convinced that I really lived through all of that, that I made it. And every night I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm wondering, are they doing those things to my husband, to his families? You know, so I've pretty well stayed away from church and different things because it's still hard for me, myself, to accept. But I got a very warm reception from the people.
I understand. Before we conclude, I'd like to call on my distinguished friend and colleague from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, greatly appreciate your strength and your courage and your willingness to testify here today. Too often, the world disbelieves the atrocities that occur. They wish to live a fantasy to think that the world is a very peaceful place and that somehow these things never occur. And it's only through words and testimony that you've provided here that we can help to make people who are idealistic realists, and that we can then create that realism into some foreign policy which hopefully can prevent this continued atrocity in the world. I certainly, as a human being, find it difficult to understand how we can continue to sit and just permit the continued atrocities of someone who has obviously forfeited the right to be called a human being, Saddam Hussein. He has permitted, as the head of his country, atrocities which none of us can comprehend fully because those of us who sit here have not experienced the enormousness of the horrors that go with those sort of atrocities. Perhaps your testimony will be the basis for this country waking up to understanding that we are not immune just because we are across the ocean from this sort of human rights abuse, that our citizens still remain in that country, that we have, by some estimates, 3,000 people who this very moment may be terrorized and tortured by this very inhuman regime. And so you have done a service not just to Kuwait, but for all mankind, because we must tell the world of the enormousness of what is going on. We appreciate it and thank you very much.
It was 51 years ago that Adolf Hitler unleashed unspeakable horrors on mankind. And the initial reaction of vast numbers was one of disbelief or lack of interest. Saddam Hussein has now unleashed on the people of Kuwait unspeakable horrors. He is ready to unleash unspeakable horrors to other nations in the area. And it is the responsibility of all of us to awaken an indifferent and disinterested world community to what this new Hitler means. With your presence and with your courageous and moving testimony, you have done mankind a major service. The Congressional Human Rights Caucus, if it has done nothing in the last 8 years but bring this one hearing to the attention of the American people, it has served its purpose. I want to thank all of you. This hearing is concluded.
That concludes this hearing of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. Join us later tonight for a speech to Britain's Conservative Party conference by Britain's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. That's tonight beginning at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. on the West Coast. Coming up next, it's a news conference with House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Dan Rostenkowski. To give our viewers a better understanding of the Persian